Welcome to the Overhead Crane Basics training module. At the end of this module, you will be able to identify and describe the three main types of industrial cranes, identify two types of controllers, list the three things that must be verified before a lift, define and describe rigging and slings, describe basic safety inspections for overhead industrial cranes, their components, and rigging. And describe guidelines for personal protective equipment when working around cranes. Cranes are machines used to lift and move heavy loads. Because of their great power, cranes can be the most dangerous piece of equipment at a work site. Every year in the United States, crane-related accidents lead to hundreds of injuries, several dozen deaths, and millions of dollars in property damage. Because of the potential for accidents, operating a crane requires great responsibility. Cranes are used in factories, warehouses, and shipyards to provide lifting and movement of heavy objects within the area covered by the crane's area of operation. Three primary types of cranes are used in industrial settings: bridge cranes, gantry cranes, and jib cranes. Bridge cranes are mounted on parallel rails attached to elevated wall structures. The bridge is a beam that runs between the two rails. A trolley with a hoist mechanism travels back and forth on the bridge. Gantry cranes have a bridge supported by two legs that move along floor-mounted rails or on wheels. As with the bridge crane, a trolley runs back and forth on the bridge. Jib cranes have a jib or a boom that is mounted to a wall or a mast. The jib crane swings in an arc around its pivot, and the trolley runs from end to end on the jib. The term rigging refers to any equipment used to attach a load to the crane's hook. Slings are the most common type of rigging. They support a load by wrapping around it or by connecting to it. Other examples of below-the-hook rigging devices are clamps, magnets, vacuum lifters, C-hooks, and spreader beams. Knowing safe rigging practices can be just as important as knowing how to operate a crane. For more details on rigging practices, check out our Crane Rigging Safety module. Industrial overhead cranes have controllers that give the operator control of all of the crane movements: bridge travel, trolley travel, and hoist raise and lower. The controller will either be a pendant control, meaning it's hardwired to the crane structure, or a wireless radio control. Some cranes will have both, with the pendant control acting as backup to the radio control. A pendant control requires the operator to walk with the load as it travels along the bridge. There are three things that must be verified before a lift is attempted. The crane and rigging must have been inspected. The crane and rigging must have enough capacity to lift the load. And the load and rigging must be stable. The rest of the module will discuss common inspections performed on cranes and rigging components. The first thing to inspect before using a crane is the area where the crane will operate. The area should be clear of obstacles that would prevent the safe movement of the crane and the load. Remove any obstacles that someone might trip on. Clean up any liquids on the floor that might be a slipping hazard. If there is liquid on the floor, ensure that it didn't leak from a crane component. Check out the intended path of the load. Make sure it is clear of personnel and any obstacles such as debris, vehicles, or other equipment that might block the load's movement. Don't just look on the floor. Look up, too. There may be obstacles blocking the movement of the crane bridge that might not be obvious. A visual inspection of the crane components must be completed by the operator before the crane is turned on. The operator should look for any problems with the main crane mechanisms that would interfere with proper operation. This includes problems with the bridge or trolley. The operator should look for any deterioration or leakage in any pneumatic or hydraulic lines or components. Your workplace will have its own checklist of specific inspections that must be done before crane operation. The hoists on different cranes use different hoisting lines. Wire rope is used on larger cranes. Smaller cranes can use link chain, leaf chain, or roller chain. Operators must perform a simple visual inspection of all hoist lines and main rigging lines before operating the crane. For wire ropes, look for problems such as broken strands, kinking, bird caging, and knots. For chain links, look for distorted links or cracked links. If there is any problem with a rope or chain, it should be rejected. When in doubt about whether a rope or chain is safe, talk to a supervisor before lifting. Hooks can be damaged from normal wear and tear or from lifting heavy loads. Reject hooks with either of the following problems: stretched more than 5% in excess of the normal throat opening, or twisted more than 10 degrees from the plane of the unbent hook. After visually inspecting the work area and the crane, a test of the crane's movements must be performed. The primary movements for most cranes are bridge movement in both directions, trolley movement in both directions, and hoist movement, raise and lower. Verify that the crane operates correctly with no problems. When running the crane, look for unusual movement and listen for unusual noise that could indicate a problem. Also, test the brakes and the emergency stop brake to make sure the brake is working for all three types of crane movement. Some cranes have status lights that tell whether the crane is currently powered or unpowered. If your crane has these lights, check to make sure they are working correctly. Cranes must have an audible alarm that sounds when the crane is moving, unless the crane operator can clearly see the entire path of travel. Test all warning bells or alarms on the crane. Alarms should be loud enough to be heard over the site's ambient noise. Along with the trolley and bridge movement inspection, it's very important to check the limit switches. The upper limit switch is a safety device that prevents the load block from contacting the hoist assembly. If the block rises too high and trips the upper limit switch, the switch is designed to shut the crane off. Some cranes have a lower limit switch that provides the same protection when a hoist is extended all the way down. Limit switches are only an emergency device. Never use a limit switch as a way to raise a load all the way up or lower it all the way down. To test the limit switch, start with the load block a couple feet from the limit switch. Slowly inch the hoist upward by going quickly back and forth between the raise control and neutral. If the limit switch works and stops the load block, lower the block a few feet and raise it again at full speed. If the limit switch doesn't work at any point in the testing process, stop using the crane immediately, put out a warning tag, and notify your supervisor. Safety inspections are very important. Always perform all inspections required by your workplace before use. If you find equipment that is not safe to use, it is your duty to report the problem so that it can be repaired. If the crane or the rigging has problems and must be left unattended, place warning tags in a visible location so everyone will know to not operate the crane. More extensive inspections of cranes and crane components are required at longer intervals. These extensive inspections are done by qualified personnel, not by the crane operator. When working around industrial cranes, follow these rules about personal protective equipment. Wear gloves to protect your hands from bruises, cuts, and rope burn. Wear steel-toed shoes to protect your feet from dropped loads or equipment. Avoid loose clothing and jewelry that may cause snags. Tuck in your shirt so the loose ends do not cause a snag. And, finally, wear a hard hat to protect against head injuries. Your workplace might have other rules about required protective equipment, such as eye protection or hearing protection. This module has described basic operating principles of overhead industrial cranes. It has also described common safety inspections performed on cranes and their rigging. Crane operators should always get the appropriate training for the specific equipment they will be using on the job. With proper training and constant attention to safe operating procedures, crane operators will avoid injuries, fatalities, and property damage.